Thank you. So if I just have a second to get myself set up. So my name is Patrick, sometimes known as Paddy, so depending on who you ask. So I'm married to Kate. I have two children who you may see running around the church, Evelyn and Ada. For my job, I work for a group of 12 local state schools. So I'm responsible for looking after the kind of organisational and business sides of those schools. So I look after things like finance and HR and buildings, things like that. Kate and I have been coming to this church for about 12 years now. We look after the youth work at this church. And I'm also involved in youth work at a youth group called Urban Saints, which is a youth group that meets on Stoke Park for boys and young men in Guildford. And that's one of our Hope Works charities, which you hear a little about sometimes. So this morning we're going to look at one of Jesus' parables. If you need a Bible, as Dan said, put your hand up and one will get brought over to you. What would you say, those of you who've been in church for a while, what's the best known of Jesus' parables? Good Samaritan, okay. Loaves and the fishes. Water into wine. Okay, well, you haven't mentioned mine, that's fine. But it's also quite a well-known one. So you will almost certainly have heard of it before if you've been in church for a while. Now, parables are short stories with a meaning or analogies that Jesus used to illustrate a point. Last week, Maddie spoke to us about a parable. It was the parable of the lost son, or lost sons, if you listen to Maddie's talk. And this week, we're going to look at another. And the words will appear on the screen if you need them. So if Kate could come up to read this for us. It's on page 704 of these Bibles. And it's Luke chapter 6, verse 46 to 49.
Okay. The wise and foolish builders. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? As for everyone who comes to me and hears my words and puts them into practice, I will show you what they are like. They are like a man building a house, who dug down deep and laid the foundation on rock. When a flood came, the torrent struck that house but could not shake it because it was well built. But the one who hears my words and does not put them into practice is like a man who builds a house on the ground without a foundation. The moment the torrent struck that house, it collapsed and its destruction was complete.
Thank you. Thank you to Josh for moving on the slides. When I'm at work and I forget to move on the slides, I just end up several slides behind. So it's great to turn around and find that someone's done it for me. So last week, Maddie introduced her talk with a sermon in a sentence, and I thought that was a great idea. So I'm going to have a go at a sermon in a sentence, but I'm never one to be accused of brevity, so it's a sermon in 2 sentences. So life can be stormy. Jesus tells us to weather the storm, but do we do what he says? Jesus tells us how to weather the storm, but do we do what he says? Now, if you've heard this story before, particularly if you grew up in Sunday school in church, you probably would think of a picture that looks a little bit like this. You might have met before, so you get the classic picture of the house on the beach and the house on the cliff. Now, before I tell you why I think that might not be quite the right interpretation of Jesus' words, I need to make a confession. I need to confess to a slightly eccentric hobby. I don't know how you relax at the weekends. There's all sorts of things people do to pass the time and relax and recharge for the week. But I've got this slightly odd hobby, which is I like building things. And I don't know quite where this came from. You could argue it's because my wife sends me out to build things. You could say it's because I trained to be an engineer. I've never actually worked and put that into practice in engineering. So maybe I've got this kind of unfulfilled career. But either way, Kate wanted a new shed. So I've been building a new shed. But rather than go to B&Q and buy something that's kind of flat pack you assemble, I've kind of been making my own creation. And I should say it's taken quite a long time and it's not finished yet. But here is my shed, as of yesterday. It's not finished. You can see there's some bits missing, we're still working on it. But the shed is coming along. And I'm hoping that you're all sitting there admiring that shed, thinking, that looks really good, he knows what he's doing, that's really good bit of building work, that is. But actually, there's one really important bit of that structure that you can't see. And you can't really tell if I've built that properly unless you can see this bit of the structure. What is it? The foundations, beneath the ground. The most important part of that building, you can't actually see. It's out of sight. You don't really notice it once the building's built. It's one of the most time-consuming, expensive bits to build. But actually, it's really important. And when, in my job, I often commission buildings to be built at our schools. And again, when the builders come to build those buildings, you often get the teachers sort of saying 3-4 months after they started, what are they doing? They've just been playing in the mud for months. I can't see anything. There's just a great big hole. Well, that is because they're spending their time and our money on building the foundations. And actually, once the foundation is right, the rest of the building comes up really quickly and easily. So this story is recorded twice in the Bible. So we've read it from Luke, but it's also also reported in the book of Matthew. And the story comes at the end of a sermon that Jesus has given. Now, we can't actually be certain whether it's the same sermon, recorded slightly differently in the two books, or whether it's two different sermons. They're very similar. And it may be that Jesus gave two similar sermons on different occasions to different audiences. But either way, both writers record a very similar story, but the emphasis is slightly different. So Matthew is what is often quoted and talks about building on sand and building on rock, which is where that picture comes from. But if we look in the wording from Luke, we get just a slightly different slant on the interpretation. So Luke talks about digging down deep. He talks about building a foundation on the rock. He talks about the foolish man building a house on the ground without a foundation. So the wording is a bit more about digging and foundations rather than sand and rocks. And actually, you can kind of make sense of this if you think about the structure of the ground, particularly in the Promised Land where Jesus was. So if you dig in the ground, you've normally got some grass, you've got some topsoil, and eventually you hit some bedrock. Now in Guildford, if you dig down, you will hit chalk. And depending on where you are in Guildford, you either hit chalk really quickly or you've got to go a really long way down before you find it. So in the Promised Land, you've had a layer of rock, probably a relatively shallow level of a layer of soil, and then you'd have some sand and surface. I suspect the grass wouldn't have looked quite as lush as it looks in my picture. And it would be really tempting to come along and see that top layer of soil baked nice and solid and think, actually, I can build my house on that. It looks really, really sturdy. That would be a really tempting thing to do. But actually, what would happen is when the rains come in the winter, when the ground softens, your building would start to settle and would start to collapse. So instead, that's the one on the right, built on the surface. Instead, what you do is the one on the left. You dig down until you get to rock, or if you can't get to rock, you build a foundation out of concrete these days. So you dig down until you get to something solid, you build off that solid platform, build up through the ground, and then you build your house on top. And the house on the left will be robust and strong, come what may. The house on the right is liable to collapse. But of course, once the house is built, what do you see? You just see what's on the surface. So both houses could look the same. They could look equally impressive or unimpressive. Actually, you've got to kind of know what's going on under the surface to know whether it's been done properly. So the passages aren't inconsistent with each other, because actually if we interpret Matthew as the sand and the rock this way, the passages are consistent, but they have a slightly different emphasis. So if we come back to my shed, you'll be pleased to know I have built a foundation, but I got to hire a digger, I got to hire a cement mixer. They were hard to come by in Jesus' day, those sorts of things. So it was a lot of work. You can see it was nice and muddy. It took a very long time, and it was a lot of work. And at times, you kind of thought, shall I just cut corners here? Shall I just make the foundations a bit smaller so it's a bit easier, a bit cheaper? And well, we'll find out in a year or two whether or not I cut too many. So, if we want to understand a parable, we have to start thinking about what do the different elements in the story mean. So I think there's kind of 4 elements in this story. There's the house, building the house. There's the sand. There's the rock. And there's the storm. And we're going to have a little look at those different parts of the story. But to understand what those parts mean, we have to kind of... actually, no, before we do that, we're going to do a quick demo. So leading at Urban Saints, I always try and keep talks kind of engaging. So I'm going to come up here and just do a little demo for you of what this might have looked like. This is probably going to go disastrously wrong, but we'll see. Right, we'll come back to the cake in a bit. That's relevant as well, so we'll put that down there. Come back to the cake. Right, we'll move this out of the way. Remind me to put it back at the end, or you won't be able to see the screen. So, I'm going to do a little bit of finishing off of construction, because I thought if there was a great big crash during the worship, it would kind of slightly confuse everyone. So we've got two buildings here. Let's just finish them off. So one of them is built in here. I've got a layer of bricks, and then I've got a layer, which is going to be our rock, and then I've got a layer of sand. So the slightly shorter one is because it's built on the bricks. The slightly taller one is built on the sand. So if I just find ourselves a little flash flood. So here we go, right. So we've got a wise builder built on the rock. We've got our foolish builder built on the sand. So when the flash flood comes along, well, they both look quite good, don't they, these houses? If anything, that one's a bit more impressive. It's a bit taller. But when the flash flood comes and we wash away the soil that it's built on, we're just about surviving there, aren't we? So the house on the rock holds fast. The house on the sand, if we have our flash flood, down it goes. Unfortunately, our foolish builder went down with it, but you get the idea. By being founded on the rock, the structure, thank you, has held fast. Thank you very much, Barney. So there you go, it did just about work. Great, thank you. Right, so we're going to just look back at a different part of the Bible to get a hint as to what some of these symbols might have meant. And we're going to turn back to the book of Isaiah. So if you've got the church Bible, it's on page 485. Our Bible is split into two parts. There's the Old Testament, which covers the period before Jesus was born, and the New Testament, which covers the period after. So we're going to go back into the Old Testament. This is 700 years or so before Jesus was born. And the context here is that Isaiah is speaking to the people of Israel who have turned away from God. Israel is facing a military threat from a country called Assyria, so a major world power that's conquered other nations, it's gobbled up other countries, and it's got Israel in its sights. So that's the context. And Isaiah is calling on Israel to turn back to God. So they've turned away from God, he's calling on them to turn back, to trust God to protect them. But Israel's leaders decide to take matters into their own hands, and they go and sign a kind of mutual defense treaty with Egypt. So they think, let's cover ourselves that way. We don't need God. We'll sign a treaty with another country and they'll protect us. And Isaiah can see the obvious problem here, which if you know your Bible, Egypt isn't like the most reliable ally to Israel. So they think it's a great idea, but actually Isaiah thinks this is just a recipe for disaster. And if we look at this passage from Isaiah, so he says, therefore, hear the word of the Lord, you scoffers who rule this people in Jerusalem. You boast we've entered into a covenant with death. Now that covenant with death is probably referring to this treaty with Egypt, which might have been guaranteed by Osiris, the Egyptian goddess of death. With the realm of the dead you have made an agreement. When an overwhelming scourge passes by, it cannot touch us, for we have made a lie our refuge and a falsehood our hiding place. That's our first structure. We've made a refuge out of a lie and a falsehood. So this is what the sovereign Lord says. See, I lay a stone in Zion. This is our next structure. A tested stone, a precious cornerstone for a sure foundation. The one who relies on it will never be stricken with panic. I will make justice the measuring line and righteousness the plumb line. Hail will sweep away your refuge. The light and the water will overflow your hiding place. Your covenant with death will be annulled. Your agreement with the realm of the dead will not stand. When the overwhelming scourge sweeps you by, you will be beaten down by it. So again, this idea of there being two structures, one of which stands, one of which does not. Now, Jesus knew his Bible well. He quoted from Isaiah on several occasions, so he would have been aware of this passage, and probably many of those listening to him would as well. Now, at the time, the Jews believed that sure foundation, I've got highlighted there, that was the rock on which the temple is built in Jerusalem. So the temple was built on a mountain or hill in a location that's really significant in the Bible. It crops up throughout the Bible. So you may remember we did a series a while ago where we talked about Abraham nearly sacrificing his son Isaac on the top of a mountain called Mount Moriah. And he was saved when God stepped in and provided a ram for Abraham to sacrifice instead. That was at the top of this mountain. It also crops up later on in the time of King David. So God is punishing Israel by sending a plague or a disease. And it's kind of in the form of this angel of destruction. And the angel of destruction approaches Jerusalem and God says, enough, stop. And the angel stops at this at the time being used as a threshing floor, this rock. And that rock is in that same place on that same hill. Later on, David builds an altar at that spot to offer a sacrifice for God for stopping that plague. And Solomon later builds the temple on that spot. So for kind of the rest of the time in the Bible, there's a temple there. And even today, that place is a place of significance to both Jews and Muslims. So it now has a mosque built on it. Does anyone know what that mosque is called? Dome of the Rock. It's the rock again, yeah. This idea of the rock on that mountain keeps coming up. So for the Jews, Isaiah's rock and sure foundation was God's temple. But in this story, Jesus offers an alternative meaning, and that is that he is the rock. So he says, if we build our house on the rock, we do that by following his teaching. And he's kind of claiming this promise from Isaiah, this promise back here, indicating that he is that sure foundation. And just to kind of link to that again, we can flip ahead to later in the New Testament. So this is the book of 1 Peter. So Peter was one of Jesus' closest friends and followers. And Peter directly quotes that verse from Isaiah. See, I lay a stone in Zion, a chosen and precious cornerstone. And he relates it to Jesus. So he's saying that actually Jesus is that cornerstone for us. So that's kind of the complicated answer as to what's meant by the rock. There is also a much simpler answer, you'll be pleased to know. So if we jump back to the passage in Luke, Jesus actually tells us what he means by the rock and the sand. So he talks about the rock being like hearing his word and putting it into practice. He talks about building on the sand, building without the foundation, as being like hearing his word but not actually doing anything about it. So I was thinking of, what's some other analogies we could use to give us an idea of this. And I thought, this is where the cake comes in, I thought I'd be really generous. And I thought I'd make you all a cake this morning so you can enjoy looking at the cake. See, it's a nice cake, well made, spent ages making that. Do you think it looks good? Looks appetizing, looks tasty, doesn't it? Well, we'll see, won't we? I'm going to put the cake back over here because I'm going to take that home for us to have our lunch with. But I'm glad you kind of enjoyed the cake. Glad you benefited from that. Hope you feel I'm generous. Have I missed the point? Have I missed something here? What were you expecting?
I want to eat it.
You want to eat the cake? It's all right, I'll put it out in refreshments later. But yeah, you want to eat the cake. You don't just want to look at the cake. As another analogy, so I have here a piece of fitness equipment, quite a small piece of fitness equipment. So has anyone ever gone and bought some fitness equipment and then not actually used it? Anyone done that? Yeah, a few hands going up. So you know what happens, you've got a good intention, maybe it's January the 1st, you go to the sports shop in the sales, you buy all the kits, it kicks around the house for a little bit and then it gets put in the cupboard out of the way. Does that fitness equipment make you any healthier? No. So anyone who admires the cake, looks at it, looks at the texture of the crumb or the quality of the icing, those sorts of things, but doesn't actually eat it, they kind of miss the point. The point is to taste the cake and to eat it. In the same way, what would you say to someone who goes and buys all this fitness equipment? They might even, maybe they put it on their mantelpiece because fitness is so important to them, just to kind of show off how important it is to stay fit and healthy. Are they going to be healthy? No, they've missed the point. So in both these cases, it's about understanding what actually something was for and not missing the point. So when Jesus teaches us something and tells us something, what's the point? We do it, we listen, we do it. It's not just about listening to what he says. And that sometimes is what we can actually end up doing in church. So let me just look at this slide is a list of the things that Jesus covers in those sermons before this passage. I'd love to see Jesus' sermon in a sentence for the Sermon on the Mount. It doesn't quite conform to that 1 point kind of rule that we have these days. So there's all sorts of topics Jesus covers. He talks about how to be happy. He talks about worry. He talks about conflict. He talks about judging others. He talks about our priorities. There's a huge amount of stuff that he picks up. Does anyone feel, looking at that list on the screen, that they've got all those areas sorted? Because I certainly haven't. Have you learned not to worry about anything? Have you learned to avoid judging other people? Are all your priorities in line with God's? If not, and certainly mine aren't, then we've all got to take this on board. This is relevant to all of us. And if you've been coming to church for a long time, you'll have read these teachings loads of times. You'll have heard them in sermons. There might even be someone who's discussed it at their home group, or perhaps even somebody here has kind of gone to theological college and studied it in the original Greek that Luke wrote it in. We spend lots of time discussing the merits of the things that Jesus says, and that's great, but actually what's Jesus interested in? He's not interested in how long we've spent studying this or how much we've discussed it. He's interested in, did you actually do it? The problem is that we often study Jesus' work but don't actually act on it. We can perhaps pick and choose the things that we want to hear or follow. Maybe we think that something, we can't really have meant that because it doesn't really fit with our culture. It's not really acceptable these days to say that. Maybe we avoid some bits that involve big changes for us because that's difficult and painful. And just like the cake, just like the dumbbells, that is missing the point. I've got 2 daughters I mentioned earlier. Sometimes I get the job, and it's an experience this, I get the job of taking them to school. It's particularly fun if Kate's already gone to work and I've got to get them out of the house by myself. And there's all the kind of chaos going on, and they're running in different directions. And I basically keep saying to them, can you get ready to go? Can you get your bag? Can you put your shoes on? Can you go and get your coat? And however many times I say this, they always seem to have something else they want to do, or something else they need to tell me, or something else they need to explain. And that's great, and I love hearing it. But what do I care about in that moment? I just want to get them out of the house. And so what I keep saying is, can you just do what I'm telling you? That's great, but can you just do what I'm telling you? And I sometimes wonder, as I read kind of these passages, whether Jesus sometimes feels the same way about us, when we're kind of fussing about things that we kind of think are important, but actually Jesus has told us are trivial. He said, you don't need to worry about that. I've told you, don't worry about that. Does he sometimes feel a little bit exasperated in that way? So turning back to the meanings in the parable, so building a house refers to how we live our lives. So this is about the things that we value and prioritize. It's about the decisions that we make. It's about the way that we treat the people around us. The sand, building a house on the sand, as I talked about earlier, that's the easy option, isn't it? It's I can just get on and build it. So it's the easy and attractive option. It's going with the crowd, so maybe doing and saying the things that sound good to the people we work and socialize with. It's about prioritizing the things that are valued by our culture, perhaps not by God, maybe seeking short-term satisfaction and doing what's right in our eyes. Like Israel in the time of Isaiah, this could be trusting in our own abilities to solve a problem, rather than focusing on God and letting him help us out. It could be about putting all our energies into maybe earning our next promotion or pay rise. It could be making sure we get what we want at the expense of the other people around us. It might be getting our own back on somebody who's upset us. If we base our lives on those sorts of things, on doing those things, on those priorities, it's like building our house on sand. It's easy, it's attractive, it might sometimes look impressive to a bystander, but actually when the storms come, it's not going to survive. Whereas building on the rock is the difficult, costly, laborious approach. It's taking that time to really kind of get things right. It might feel unnecessary and unimpressive at the time. When you're digging your foundation and the guy next door isn't bothering, you might feel like this is a waste of time. But if we know it's what God wants, then it isn't. Building a house on the rock might prompt people to say things like, I'll use some expressions here you might have heard, you don't really need to do that. It doesn't matter if you say that. No one will find out if you do that. Those sorts of expressions might be said to us if we're standing firm and doing what God wants. Building on the rock might mean prioritizing the things that matter to Jesus rather than the things that matter to us or those around us. It could mean giving your money to something God wants you to support. And that might be at the expense of getting something else that you want. It might mean giving up time for things, maybe to serve at church or elsewhere, maybe to spend time with someone who needs your help. And that, again, might come at the cost of feeling busy or of not doing something else that you wanted to spend your time on. It might be something like paying your taxes, declaring everything on your tax return, or not taking the advantage of getting a saving by paying cash in hand for something. It might be focusing on what God wants, even when that doesn't look as impressive to everybody else. Now, we've got to be careful here, because it would be easy to think that following Jesus is all about our own actions. It isn't. So none of us are capable of following all of those points that were in that sermon. None of us will get that right all the time. We all mess up. We all get things wrong. But if you think back to that rock I spoke about in Isaiah, that rock was a place of sacrifice and mercy. So Abraham was about to sacrifice Isaac, but God provided a ram to be sacrificed in his place. When God was punishing Israel with the plague, that rock was where God said, stop. And David then offered a sacrifice on that spot. Solomon built the temple. That was where the Israelites used to go. If they got something wrong, they would go and make a sacrifice at that temple so that God could forgive them. And Jesus, who now claims this promise, became the rock for us and the sure foundation for us by dying for us on the cross to forgive our sins. So this isn't about us having to do all of this in our own strength. This rock is actually a place of mercy and sacrifice. So the final part of this, the storm, we haven't really looked at yet. And perhaps this is one of the most interesting bits in the parable. Because which builder, the wise one or the foolish one, which builder gets hit by the storm? Both, yeah. Don't we sometimes think God's going to protect us from the storms? We sometimes read our Bible and think, oh, God will stop all the bad things happening in our lives. When something goes wrong, the first thing we sort of do is we ask, God, what were you doing? Why did that happen? Why did you allow that to happen to me? But actually, if you read the Bible, it doesn't say bad things won't happen. This storm hits both builders. Sometimes God protects us from things, and there are some wonderful accounts in the Bible of where God rescues his people from persecution. You can think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego not going into the fiery furnace, and God rescuing them out of that after they refused to bow down to Nebuchadnezzar. You could think of David, who trusted in God and defeated the giant Goliath. But actually, throughout the Bible, the picture is not that God stops all the bad things from happening. The Bible never offers a widespread guarantee that bad things won't happen. And to illustrate that, if you just think about Jesus' followers, so Jesus' 12 closest friends and followers, we believe that 11 of those met an untimely death, and the 12th one died in prison. So there isn't this guarantee that bad things will never happen. If bad things happen to us, that doesn't automatically mean we've done something wrong. It certainly doesn't mean God has broken his promise to us, because he doesn't say the storms won't come. What he does do is give us the strength to withstand the storm, even to thrive within the storms. So by trusting in Jesus, by listening to him and doing as he says, we can be confident that we can stand firm, however bad things get and however hard we find them, just like the building on the rock foundations. The storms in life can take many forms. So at the time of Jesus, the Jews that were listening to him, had a long history of military threat and religious persecution. They've been invaded over hundreds of years by 4 different world powers, each possibly worse than the last. Fortunately, we don't kind of face that imminent military threat. We enjoy relative religious freedom in this country. But actually, our national security and religious security has changed quite a lot in recent years. There's lots of things that have happened in the world that have changed that picture. And if we read the Bible, we realise we can't assume we will always enjoy freedom to the extent that we do right now. Another obvious storm that has hit in recent years is the COVID pandemic. We're still seeing now the impact that's had on children, the impact that's had on society, on the economy. That was a big storm that affected the whole country and individuals. On a more personal level, many of us will encounter storms, perhaps bereavement, family breakdown, financial hardship, or mental or physical illness. We will hit these storms at times in our lives. However much we try to avoid them, the storms will come. And unfortunately, they're not fun when you're in the middle of a storm. Even the man with the house on the rock, it probably wasn't great fun when the storm was coming. But the question isn't whether the storm will hit us, it's whether or not we're ready for it. Because it wasn't fun being in the storm on the rock, but actually the man who built his house there had a confidence that he knew that he built his house properly and that it was going to last. So are we trusting in Jesus rather than relying on our own strength? Have we listened to him and put his teaching in practice? Because if our lives are built on Jesus, then they'll be resilient. If we hear his word and put it into practice, then however difficult the storms, however hard the challenges, we can be assured that he will be there for us and he will bring us through. And so ultimately, that is the reason why I follow Jesus, which is the question I was asked to answer in the first place, is he's the surest and most reliable foundation we can possibly build our lives upon. So the challenge this morning I want to leave you with, have you put your faith in Jesus? Are you prioritizing the things that matter to him? Are you making sure that your life is built upon his rock?